Peggy, you are muted.
Yes, I mute until we're ready to start, so we don't have a whole lot of editing stuff to cut out.
Okay, I'm sorry, never mind.
That's okay, no problem. We are just about ready to start. We're just missing a lot of people here. People are showing up right now. Everybody hear me? Okay. Yes, I think you can.
You know, so I always so we always check out the movies. So Laura grew up in Kansas City. Well, better than I should. So now, what you say? So I was like, more than I thought it was, but it's called out. And it was going to it's going to be windy. So any we're called the rest of the yeah, over about Ridge Park. I'm traveling today. I agree. Yeah. So how long will you be there?
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's a little over. I'm going to assume some people will still show up. That's okay. His legs are right. There's no comfortable way to do this. Okay, there we go. I'm settled. I'm hoping that we'll get through the High Renaissance in Italy, not Venice yet, but just in the rest of Italy today, but we'll see. I wanted to start with a little review of the last thing we looked at. We were talking about the early Renaissance, and I was particularly talking about the new techniques, the new scientific devices that artists were beginning to use because they suddenly care about making things look realistic or believable, 3 dimensions in a believable space. And we talked about linear perspective, particularly 1-point linear perspective, and chiaroscuro. And we saw both of those in this fresco by Masaccio. We talked about the orthogonal lines that converge at the vanishing point, and chiaroscuro, which is the modeling of form using shadow and highlight. Chiaroscuro is, by definition, a gradual shift. There's another terminology when you have an abrupt shift. We'll talk about that later. They don't use that in the Renaissance. But this is a good example of chiaroscuro, that very gradual shift that creates a 3-dimensional form. I also mentioned briefly the fact that you can have more than one vanishing point. 1-point perspective assumes that all the forms are placed parallel to the picture plane and that they diminish perpendicular to the picture plane. But what if you have something that isn't? What if it's sort of at an angle? Well, then you need more than one vanishing point. And I brought in some examples. This is an example of 2-point perspective. So these little boxes, rather than being straight on and straight back, are skewed at an angle. So you need 2 vanishing points on the same horizon line. And in fact, if you depict something above the horizon line, that creates the illusion you're looking up at it. I mean, imagine, did that get locked?
No, I think it didn't.
Yeah. We're coming. Make sure that it's not locked. So imagine that you're looking out and you see the horizon line. If there's something above that, then from your point of view, you're looking up at it. And if there's something below it, you're looking down at it. And if it's right on that horizon eye level, then you're looking straight at it from the side. This is really just a recognition of how we see. It's a scientific way of reproducing what our brain does every time we look out at the world. Our brain knows how to read these things. We can read when something's up high and down low, but your brain is making all these calculations. You're just not thinking about it. So this is artists now calculating it so that on a flat surface, like a painting, they can reproduce that illusion and make you really feel where an object is in space. You can have 3-point perspective, you can have 4, 5, 10, 20-point perspective. If you've got forms that are all different angles, you can still use accurate scientific perspective. And it's really not that hard. You just have to know where the horizon line is and then adjust your angles. The other thing we talked about before we left was this memento mori in the predella. Remember, the predella is that horizontal section at the bottom of an altarpiece. And memento mori are common in art. They're not new. You saw them in, well, we didn't see any examples, but they were in late medieval art as well. We'll continue to see them really up through 17th, even into the 18th century. And I can even think of 19th and 20th century works of art where an artist plays with that idea. Memento mori is a reminder of death, is what it means. And it could be a skull or a skeleton. We'll see in the 17th century, it takes other forms. It's anything that reminds you of your mortality. And it's meant to keep you humble, to keep you from being vain or somehow thinking you're not an ordinary living being on this planet. One of the things we see in early Renaissance painting, because of this new freedom, is we're going to see a lot of different styles. There's, Masaccio's was one way of working, and it was very, very scientific and very methodical. But not all artists care as much about the realism of space and form as Masaccio did. Fra Angelico has a very different point of view, and that's because of who he was. Fra Angelico simply means brother Angelico, and he was a Dominican monk. He was a professional painter before he entered the monastery, and he continued to be a professional painter after, but he only painted for other Dominican monasteries. He painted a number of frescoes in monasteries, and this is a fresco he painted in his own monastery, and it's one of 9 paintings that deal with what are called the 9 ways of prayer. And this particular painting is associated with the Hail Mary prayer, and it was painted on the wall. It is a fresco, so it was painted on the wall at the top of the staircase that led to the private quarters or the private cells of the monks. So this wasn't for the public. This only the monks in this monastery would ever see this. And there is an inscription at the bottom of it. It says, "As you revere this figure of the intact Virgin while passing before it, beware lest you omit to say a Hail Mary." So the point is, every time they passed this, they would say a Hail Mary prayer. And the other 8 prayers around the monastery, every time you passed one, you would say a different or specific prayer. So it's very much a function. His style is very quiet, very modest. It's about clarity and piety. It is a measured sense of space. He's using architecture. We saw Masaccio using architecture to sort of carve out space. Fra Angelico, which just means angelic brother, really, is sort of doing the same thing to create this sort of open air portico where the Annunciation is taking place. We recognize the Annunciation now as a popular scene, and it's going to continue to be so. However, he's not as concerned with the accuracy, particularly of the proportions of the figures figures. They're rather elongated. They're more sort of late medieval style in terms of the proportions. They're not what you would call realistic proportions. Mary is sort of elongated. There's really no sense of the body beneath her drapery, but he didn't care about that. For him, this is very much a spiritual work. He's depicting, the angel swooping in to sort of confront her, and she's very focused on him. So is it meant to be a sort of sacred vision within the monastic world? It may be. So a very unique style. Now, it's very simple and very plain until you look at the background. And when you look at that sort of forest or garden in the back and even the grass below, it becomes very, very detailed. He seems to have been very influenced by tapestries, and tapestries of the period, late medieval, early Renaissance tapestries, were very busy. They were filled with flowers and lots of little detail, and has a very strong sense of the tapestry form influencing him in this work. Yes.
How big is that?
It's large. It would be the size of a wall. So, a good size, probably close to the height of a wall. So yeah, it's large. Fra Angelico actually was beatified in 1984. So I don't really know much about that, but he's on his way to becoming a saint. So he may actually be a saint someday. I don't know the details of that, what justified that or triggered that, but I know that process has begun. So one person with a unique style, another person with a very unique style, and someone you may be familiar with, is Sandro Botticelli. Generally, when you think of Botticelli, you probably think of the Birth of Venus. Of Venus floating on this shell in the water. If you ever watch Monty Python, they use that image all the time in the openings of Monty Python. However, I think this is really his most sort of archetypal painting, and one that signifies the Renaissance more than anything else. He was working in Florence for the Medici family, and this is where the Neoplatonic Academy had been opened. Venice was a hub of learning, of classical learning. It's where so many scholars from Constantinople had come. It's where at the Neoplatonic Academy, they were teaching the ancient writers, they were teaching Greek. And so it was a place that envisioned itself as highly enlightened and wanting to express these new ideals of this new humanist, man-centered world. This particular painting is not a fresco. It is a tempera on wood, tempera on wooden panel, which is sort of an old medieval medium. We know that some artists are using oil, but they're not really using oil yet in all of Italy. We'll talk about that. When I refer to Italy, I'm generally talking about Rome, Milan, everything in sort of central. What I'm not including in that is anything in the south. I'm not talking about Naples. They've got their own history. They're a whole different world down there. I'm also not talking about Venice. We're going to talk about Venice separately. It has its own history, its own style. So it's basically, when I say Italy, everything but the south and the northeast. From Rome all the way up to Milan and all of that, I'm going to lump together because their styles are very similar, their goals are very similar. So he's working in Florence. Now, this was commissioned by and for the Medici family, and it commemorates the wedding of Lorenzo de' Medici in 1482. And it is in every way meant to be a symbol of rebirth and renewal, which a wedding is in a way, but also the Renaissance itself is. Primavera simply means spring. I mean, literally it means first green, primavera, but that is spring in Italian. And so it's linking the idea of spring and rebirth with the idea of Renaissance and also the idea of the wedding itself. So we have Venus in the middle. First of all, we have all these references to Greco-Roman mythology. In fact, it's a reference to Roman mythology. From here on, you're largely going to see Roman names because this is the part of the world where they're reading Latin, they're reading the Latin writers, and they know all about the Roman gods and goddesses. They know little or nothing about the Greek version of them, nor can many of them read or speak Greek. So you're going to see mostly Roman names and also sort of the associations of Rome more than Greece. So right in the middle, we have Venus. Venus is actually being equated with the Virgin Mary. Now, this may shock you if you just took the mythology class, because that's not an association we would naturally make. But at this time, they're beginning to make these equivalences. It's the first real depiction of Roman or Greco-Roman mythology since before the Middle Ages. You know, these were taboo subjects. These are pagan gods in a Christian world. Now, how is it the Renaissance can revive these gods and goddesses? Well, it's because they begin to make equivalences. We're going to equate Venus with Mary. Now, it's not just Venus. It's not the pagan Venus. They're looking at the Roman Venus, who was much more associated not only with physical love, but also wedded love. She was the goddess of marriage and wedded love. So that's what they're emphasizing here with Venus and the Virgin Mary. The orange trees that you see around them are linked to the Garden of the Hesperides, a garden we talked about. Didn't have orange trees, it had apple trees. There were apples in the Garden of Hesperides, but they were the golden fruit, and they belonged to Hera, the Greek goddess Hera, and they were associated with immortality. The Medici coat of arms actually has oranges on it in the coat of arms. They're embracing that idea of the apples of the Hesperides, only now they're oranges. On the far right, we see the Zephyrs, who are the winds, the west wind, or the Zephyrs, and he's grabbing a Chloris, who is a nymph, and this is where we get the word chlorophyll comes out of this. Chloris is the goddess of spring growth. And next to her, really foremost in the picture, is Flora, also associated with spring, the goddess of spring. You might recognize the three graces form that we talked about in mythology, and they're doing a kind of dance that's been identified as a dance that was often done in the Renaissance. And the purpose of it, you kind of using very slow movements, you acted out your relationship to people in this dance. I found that really interesting. I'd like to know more about it. But apparently there was a dance where your movements suggested your relationships. And that's really what they're doing. It would have been recognized as something that would have been done at a wedding party. And then we get Mercury, or Greek Hermes, but in Rome, he would be Mercury. Now, Mercury is there because at the time of the wedding, astrologically speaking, they were under the sign of Mercury and Venus at the time. And that's why he is present at the ceremony. So it's very much about rebirth, it's political. It's speaking about what the Medici family has done to bring about this rebirth in Florentine culture and celebrating it at the wedding, which itself is a rebirth. So it really is the archetypal image of what is happening in Florence in the 15th century. Now, Botticelli's style is actually somewhat similar to Fra Angelico. Yeah, Regina?
Well, it's an appropriate moment. Would you zoom in on Flora's dress?
Yes, thank you, because I keep forgetting I can do this. There are 190 distinct flowers, and 138 of them have been identified.
She looks like she's pregnant. That's what happens.
It's very likely a reference to fertility, because they often did that. There are a number of very well-known sort of wedding portraits where the bride, she's not pregnant. That wouldn't have been appropriate, but it's often done as a symbol of her future role. And this very likely, it's abundance, fecundity, that role of fertility. So yeah, the figures also are sort of disproportionate. Notice looking at the composition, it's very classically composed, it's symmetrical. The figures are laid out parallel to the picture plane. They're not really going back in space at all. They're very flat. They're almost like cut out paper dolls. They don't have a lot of three-dimensional characteristics to them. He's not concerned with that. They're elongated and sort of boneless in some ways. And he's also clearly influenced by tapestries in this floral detailing. That's his style. Everyone's got their own unique style, and that's perfectly okay. Here's a detail where you can see it's a very linear technique. We'll talk more about what that means when we look at more paintings in just a little bit. But linear technique is a way of laying down the paint in which the artist uses very tiny little brushes and makes small little lines next to one another. And they just kind of melt together. Linear techniques end up with a very smooth surface, not brush strokes, no visible brush strokes. It's very smooth. It's a technique that they really originated back in the Middle Ages. It's how you painted Byzantine icons and these earlier altarpieces. They were painted really small brushes. So this is still tempera, so they're still working that way. But even those using oil are still working that way because they haven't really adapted a new medium to its potential. So for the first century of oil, they painted with it as if it were tempera because they really just didn't know how. And we see that in this wonderful painting in the Nelson Gallery. This is a very special painting by Giovanni Bellini. The Bellini family in Venice, and we're going to spend a lot more time a little later talking about what's happening in Venice because Venetian art is more progressive than the rest of Italy. And in fact, Venetian art is of the 16th century is what's going to influence the future more so than these other artists do. And Bellini, there are two Bellini brothers, Giovanni and Gentile, and their brother-in-law really work together. And they're some of the most important artists. They're responsible really for bringing oil to Italy. They're the first workshop to use oil paint. Now we know they were using it up in Flanders, right? Up in the north. They'd been using oil through the 15th century, but it doesn't reach Italy right away. It's the Bellinis who were the first in Venice to use oil paint. However, he's still painting on wood. Now, this has subsequently been transferred to canvas. They will typically do that. There is a way of transferring, a whole oil painting. I'm not in restoration, but chemically you can loosen the paint on the back, you put something against it and lay it down. And then when you put a certain chemical on the back, you can lift it off whole and then put it onto a canvas. So it's been transferred, but it was originally painted on wood. Now, so it is a very important moment in time. It is still very linear. You see no brush strokes, you can enlarge it, move it over. You can see it's very slick, smooth surfaces. And there is an inscription. It's from the 18th Psalm. It reads, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer and my high tower." So we believe that that's why that tower is in the back. It's a reference to the Psalms, although that's never been identified as any real place. No one's ever found a real place. Seems probably just made it up. But you see here clearly the richness of color that you didn't see in those tempera icons, the richness of the blue and all the variations of color, and the use of light. The Bellini were very good at the use of light, and oil allows you to do that. And people often comment on sort of her face and the body of the child that seem to sort of be inner lit. The light seems to be in them, and that golden light sort of unites them. So when you get a chance, check that out.
Peggy, when was that practice carried out to transfer that onto canvas? Is that something that happens?
I honestly don't know, but it would have been, my assumption is in the modern era. They wouldn't have known the technique before the 20th century. And I think it's just to save it. I think the wood probably was rotting away in bad shape, and there was a risk of, losing the whole thing. So the ability to transfer it onto canvas in a more stable medium would have been, because I know they do that when they can. They'll do that a lot. I want to look at one painting now, a fresco again. You can see how prominent frescoes were in the 15th century. It was a major art form. It's on the side wall. We're going to come back. This is the first of 3 times we're going to come to the Sistine Chapel. This is the first. And we're going to look at this painting located right here on the side. All of the paintings along the walls are all done by different artists, and that's very common. That's the more common situation. Giotto was lucky when he got the commission to do all the paintings in the Arena Chapel. Typically, different artists are hired. Now, to give you a sense of scale, I show you a man here on this lift in front of one of these paintings on this wall. This painting is 12 foot by 12 foot high by 19 foot wide. The scale is very hard to read unless you have a human being in the picture. So it's a very, very large painting here in the chapel. And we'll talk more about the Sistine Chapel later when we spend more time with it. But the painting I want to look at is by an artist who was known as Perugino. He worked in Perugia, and so his nickname was Perugino, or the little guy from Perugia. It's just a nickname. I don't know his real name. I imagine that Renaissance scholars know his real name, but I'm not one of them. So all I've ever known him by is Perugino, and that's all you're going to find in almost any book about him. It's a very, very important painting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's in Rome. Everything we've looked at thus far is in Florence. Generally, that's where the Renaissance took place in the 15th century. But by the end of that century, the political power is shifting to Rome. It's where we get the beginning of the sequence of really, really powerful popes in Rome, who are spending a lot of money to bring the best artists to Rome. It begins with them wanting to bring artists down to sculptors in particular to build their tombs, to create sculpture for their tombs. The popes have these massive tombs, especially these really powerful ones, and that sort of begins this rush. But this painting in particular is all about the supremacy of papal authority. It's what it's about. It speaks to that very directly. It's also a kind of summation of the early Renaissance or the 15th century. As you can see, it's a very, very big fresco, and it depicts Christ delivering the keys to Saint Peter. The full descriptive name should be Delivery of the Keys of the Kingdom to Saint Peter. And I want to make that point. You've heard of the keys to the kingdom. I mean, if you've heard anything about Christianity, you've probably heard that phrase somewhere, the kingdom of God. The keys to the kingdom. Saint Peter was the gatekeeper to heaven, but these are not the keys to heaven. These are the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven includes heaven and earth. So any biblical reference to the kingdom of heaven means heaven and earth. That's why there are 2 keys. He's being handed a silver key and a gold key. The silver key is really important. The gold key, of course, is for heaven. The silver key is the key that symbolizes his authority, his supreme authority over the earth. And who is Saint Peter? What was his role? He's the first pope. He's the person that all popes derive their authority from. So here is a late 15th century pope, looks at this picture and sees Christ basically handing him the keys to his power on earth. This is the painting that defines the power of the Pope on earth and shows it being handed to him, St. Peter and all of his successors handed to him directly. So it's a very, very powerful statement of papal authority, and that's what it's meant to be. Now let's look at how it's composed and how he's telling us this story. It's a classical composition, which we would expect in a Renaissance painting. It's symmetrical. The figures are parallel to the picture plane, and the space itself jumps back in increments. There's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background, and it just jumps. It's not a natural or easy flow in space. It's an awkward sense of space. Perugino is demonstrating everything he's learned, all the new things he's learned about painting. And he's doing it in an accurate but somewhat awkward way. Sometimes early Renaissance artists got so caught up in their technique that drove the painting, that became almost more important than the narrative. And that's the biggest difference between early Renaissance and high Renaissance. It's not that they're going to develop new techniques, they're just going to do it better. The narrative is going to come back and be the dominant voice as opposed to the technique. Technique is there, but it's going to take a back seat. You don't have to show you know how to do this 100 years after it was invented anymore. You don't need to demonstrate that skill. Everybody knows that skill. But Perugino is still demonstrating that skill and many others. The more you look at it, the more awkward you really see it. All the figures behind Christ and St. Peter, they look like they're like standing in a queue. You know, they're all lined up. You know, that's not how you would stand. If this event were happening, you'd be, you know, around them in a circle, right? Everybody wants to see what's going on, but it's just a very awkward space. Now, the architecture is used to define space, as is this plaza. Now, this is a sort of ideal architectural space. It's not any real place. It actually comes from theoretical writings about architecture, people who were identifying what were ideal buildings. And in the Renaissance, they believed that square, circular, or octagonal were ideal buildings, centralized buildings, because they're more symmetrical. So that's not any one real building, that octagonal sort of temple-like structure. And then we get the two triumphal arches on either side. This is in Rome, and it speaks to power and everything else. And then these jumps. Notice how generally still it is. It's dominated by verticals and horizontals. The only diagonal lines are the orthogonals, which lead back to a vanishing point in the doorway of that building, with a couple of exceptions, as I'll point out. So yes, he knows how to use one-point perspective, but he doesn't know how to use it very well because he's defeating his own purpose. What orthogonal lines do is they draw the viewer's eye to that vanishing point. The problem is there's nothing happening at that vanishing point, but everyone wants to know, who are these two guys in the doorway? They're nobody. They don't mean anything. But why does everybody want to know? Well, because Perugino's telling us to look there. He's unconsciously drawing our eye to that doorway, when in fact we should be looking down here. That's so typical of 15th century art, not taking advantage of the power of the technique to really enhance the narrative. In fact, he's sort of doing exactly the opposite of enhancing the narrative. So yeah, here it is without the lines. And of course, one thing everybody wants to know is, who are those two guys in the doorway? Yeah.
Well, I'm just gonna comment that mid-ground looked like you're ice skating.
It's these guys. I'm very curious about this. I can't find anybody that's ever written about it. The only diagonals you get are some like running figures here. Two guys here, the guy here, there's some people in motion. They almost look as if they're running away from something. I can't help but wonder if this means something, if there's some symbol or something, but I can't find anything about it.
Those two little guys are standing, so we can see.
It may not.
There was nothing.
I don't see anything. There seems to be a guard or a soldier here who doesn't seem to be aware of anything happening behind his back. But these guys are gesturing in an odd way, but he's looking over here. Maybe it's the soldier somehow. Maybe there's some symbolism in who,
Right in the doorway. There's a shadow.
It looks to me like they're
in the doorway.
It's over on the left.
Oh.
That what?
You know what, after they get close like these, then they run away. Who are these two figures that we,
I don't know. I don't know any,
over here? Yeah. up
who,
there.
these guys? I don't know who any, I don't know who any of these people are, other than Jesus and Saint Peter. So don't ask me who these people are. I don't know who any of them are, nor
Contributing to the vanishing point.
these people.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's the same angle.
and
This
the
guy's-
figures are too.
But notice how diagonals create the sense of motion. It's a very good demonstration of that.
Unlike on the left, way on the left.
Well, see, look, this guy seems to be looking at something over here. This guy's looking at something over here. So it doesn't make sense. He may just have put them in there to make it a little more dynamic, just so it didn't look so still and stiff. It may not mean anything.
And they also be standing around. Looks like a game.
They're just standing around. I don't know. Well, maybe this is Jesus again. This looks like he's got a halo.
Peggy,
Yeah.
could it be that those people are distracted looking at lesser angels, even at at the other one that you showed with the kids? That person had a halo too.
Wait a minute. Who's got a halo?
Right there.
Oh, that's you. Thank you. Yes, that's Jesus. That's why they're startled. He's appeared. Thank you. I never noticed that.
On the left there, he was two.
Yeah.
Two separate scenes.
Well, and down here, we got three. So he's here three times at least. Continuous narratives. Remember, you can put the same person in multiple times, suggesting multiple moments or multiple parts of the story. So you're just gonna have to find some Renaissance person that would clarify. But thank you. I never even noticed that, but you're right. That's Jesus doing multiple things. I'm sure in something specifically on Perugino, it tells about that. I just don't. And these guys are running away because maybe he just like appeared and they're startled. I don't know. So assignment for next time, find out. So anyway, this is the main, what you're supposed to mostly be looking at, but not entirely. Okay. Where the early Renaissance incorporates basically a century, and there are a great many artists. What we call the High Renaissance is mostly 4 or 5 artists, and it's less than about 25 years long. It's one generation of the High Renaissance. And these are the great masters. 3 of them, it would be Michelangelo as a painter and sculptor, Leonardo as a painter, Raphael as a painter, Bramante as an architect, and then up in Venice, we have Titian. These are really the 5 great masters that incorporate architecture, sculpture, and painting. And by 1520, they're gone. They're either dead, gone, or working in a different style, as we'll see. The earliest to appear is Leonardo, and his work begins to show this new style or this change just the end of the 15th century. So as early as 1490, while some people are working in a clearly early style, Leonardo is working in a more in a different way. Now, I'm just showing you this because everybody knows this, but it's also a great metaphor for the Renaissance and for Leonardo. He's very, very influenced by the writings of Vitruvius. Vitruvius was a Roman architect in the 1st century BCE, and he wrote this 12 volumes, which means 12 scroll or 10, not 12, 10 volumes or 10 scrolls of writing on architecture, but it's more than about architecture. Vitruvius is writing about all sorts of things. He's writing about order in the world. He's writing about the ideal, what is the perfect building type. He's also writing about the body and the perfect body type. You know, the perfect human form is exactly 8 heads high, for example. All is described by Vitruvius, and as they're reviving their interest in the ancient world, Vitruvius becomes important again. Now, this drawing was such an important demonstration because it is the perfection of the human form. Perfect forms for Vitruvius and the Renaissance are the circle and the square, the perfect geometry of them. And what Leonardo is showing us is that not coincidentally, the human body can be perfectly inscribed in the perfect circle and the perfect square. This is a sign. This is a sign of order in the world. It's a sign that God has created us to be these perfect beings. And it is very, very tied to religion. And Leonardo speaks of this sort of mathematics and geometry in all of his works and ties them to religion. Okay. His most famous image, of course, is the image that we're familiar with as the Last Supper. This is the whole wall. You don't always get to see the whole wall, but I thought I'd show it to you before we zoom in and take a look at the Last Supper itself. It's located in Milan. It is not a fresco. It is painted on a wall, but it is not a fresco. He laid down a white layer to smooth the wall and then painted with both oil and tempera on that. It's an experiment, and all experiments don't work. And this is a good example of an experiment that doesn't work. It was unstable even before he finished it. It was falling apart. If you're going to paint on a wall, you better use real fresco and chemically bond it to that wall. This is not chemically bonded to anything. And it's been a nightmare. They've had to deal with it for a very long time. It's unstable. First of all, a door was cut into the wall. You can see the door down there at the bottom. In 1652, somebody thought it was a good idea to just put a doorway right through that wall. It's in the dining hall. The refectory is a dining hall of a monastery. And then Napoleon's troops used it as a stable during the Napoleonic Wars and the early part of the 19th century. Projectiles were thrown at it. It was damaged. It was damaged by bombing in World War II. And I seem to remember when I was young that there were problems with it relating to a flood. I remember hearing about some flood in Milan, and they had all of these sandbags trying to protect it from water. So, you know, it's been subjected to a lot. Fortunately, we have some oil paintings that were made at the time showing what it looked like exactly originally, and then we can reconstruct digitally the original colors, or at least as much as possible. The coat of arms up above is the coat of arms of the Sforza family of Milan, the sponsors, the family that paid for it, and that were supporters of this monastery. The condition today is not great, but fortunately, you know, we can digitally enhance. So let's take a look at what we have. We have now a sort of perfectly classically composed scene. Again, symmetry, planar figures. But now, instead of being quite as awkward, he presents it in a way that seems a bit more natural. It is very odd that all the figures are on one side of the table, but he does it in such a way that it isn't really disturbing. You don't really notice right away how awkward it is because he has them individually placed and grouped in natural groupings. He's also lucky because it happens to be a perfect number, 12 apostles and Christ in the center. You can't come up with a better number of people to organize for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Again, he uses architecture to define the space, but it's a very simple architecture, a very humble architecture, so that it doesn't draw your eye away from the figures. Those those dark forms on the walls are meant to be tapestries that were hanging on the wall, and they've simply darkened over time. They weren't stable. They weren't particularly stable. When we look at a painting, now this is a painting by one of Leonardo's students who was there at the time it was painted and made an oil painting. In fact, we have two of these, two different students of his made copies directly from the wall. So we can see what the door removed, and we can also see more detail under the table that's been damaged. We can see the colors and their intensity and get a greater sense of what's going on. All the figures have been identified. I can only remember a couple of them. This is Judas, and we're going to look at a detail in a minute. This is Judas right here. This is the young Saint John, who's depicted always as very, very young. And of course, Christ, the others, I don't really remember who they are specifically. This is helpful because in the image of Judas, it's a little hard to see what's going on. You can see that his left hand is reaching out and trying to grab some bread. That's a taboo thing. He's not supposed to be doing that. And his right hand, you can't quite tell what he's got, but in the painting, you can see clearly he's holding a bag of silver. This is the bag of coins, identifying him. Also, he's depicted as sort of leaning back. His face is in shadow. There are other little hidden clues that identify him for us. Now, let's talk about the composition again. What he's done is taken the 12 and dispersed them 6 on each side, and then he's broken them into 4 groups of 3. Now, these are sacred numbers. These are very special numbers. 3 and 4 are seen as holy numbers, and they symbolize the merging of the physical and the spiritual. 3 is a symbol of the Trinity. 4 is a symbol of the elements, the physical natural world, and the 4 elements, air, water, earth, and fire. So when you put them together 3 times 4, you get the 12 apostles. If you add them together, you get 7, which is also a sacred number, and appears all over the place in Christianity and other religions as well. Christ is in the center, and he forms this perfect triangle, the perfect, what we call a stabilizing triangle. There are a lot of different triangles, isosceles and different kinds, but this is an equilateral, perfectly balanced triangle. That is the most stable form that you can have is a triangle. A triangle cannot be distorted, where rectangles can be, every other form can be distorted. A perfect equilateral triangle, it's solid, it grounds him in the middle, it becomes the base and the focal point. The lines converge, the orthogonals converge at the head of Christ, drawing your eye to the vanishing point right where you should be looking. So it's now a subtle use of one-point linear perspective that doesn't glare at you, and it works the way it's meant to work. We don't have overt symbolism like halos and other things. We get subtle symbolism like the 3 windows in the back that frame Christ, the arch above the middle window, which symbolically could function as a kind of halo, or heaven above the head of Christ. So there are symbols there. They are simply subtle symbols. Now, it's not overtly emotional. Let me go back to this. It's not overtly emotional. However, it has a poignancy to it. This is a classical painting. Classical paintings have subdued emotion. We've seen that since the ancient Greek world. Classical means subdued emotions, no outward display or over the top, but it's done in a kind of poignant, frozen way. Now, depending on the source, the Synoptic Gospels, and the Synoptic Gospels is a reference to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they identify this as having been a Seder or Passover feast. However, John does not. He says that Passover was a few days after this. So they don't all agree, but you'll often see it written that this was a Seder. But we don't really know for sure if that was the case. But as each of the groups of three react, and it's supposedly the moment when Christ has just said, one of you will betray me. That's the moment. And this is when Judas is doing the taboo thing, which is the bread hasn't been broken yet, so he's not supposed to be reaching for the food, and he's certainly not supposed to have the bag of silver in his hand, which identifies him. But all of the others are sort of gasping. There's an individual reaction on the face of each of these individual people. They each have individual portraits. They all look different, and each one is responding in a different way as they all turn to each other and say, what? What'd he say? Who? Me? Is it you? What? It's this sort of frozen moment of this gasp. So he's found a way to create a kind of quiet, subdued, poignant emotion without it being a kind of over the top or drama. And that is the skill of the High Renaissance masters, is the subtlety in which not only they use the techniques that they learned, but also the subtlety in which they communicate the message of what they're telling. And I think that the most interesting parallel is when you look at Perugino's painting versus Leonardo's, and it's only a few years later. It's not a long time later, but it's worlds apart in terms of the sensibility and subtlety of how a narrative is communicated. Leonardo is doing all the same things, but he's pared it down and he's removed the distractions. He's focusing you on the important part, and certainly not the technique at all. That's really out of the picture completely, and focused on the people. And so this is why we make this distinction between early Renaissance and then when a corner is turned. And we now see people who are embracing these ideals in a very different way. His famous portrait of the Lady Lisa, Lisa Gherardini del Giocondo, art historians will often refer to this as La Gioconda. It's very typical for art historians to call it that rather than Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa is a version of her name. It's short for Madonna Lisa or Lady Lisa. Mona is short for Madonna, which means Lady Lisa. So it's a kind of personal way of referencing her and her title. It was a commissioned portrait. She is the wife of a prominent merchant in Florence. Is this the greatest work of art ever made? No. It is a really, really nice portrait, however, and it's very important and influential because it begins to establish a new kind of portraiture. That is the half-length, three-quarter view portrait, where you see someone from the waist up turned at three-quarter view. We'll be very familiar with it. It's what everybody does from here on, but he's sort of establishing a type of portrait. And then we'll see how different people interpret that. I personally love portraits. It's one of my favorite forms in art history. It's a form that, it's a subject that most people don't pay any attention to. In museums, most people ignore portraits and walk right past them. Because they don't know who the person is. It doesn't mean anything, but I particularly love portraits. You're going to see more portraits because I think portraits tell you more about a moment in time than almost any other subject out there. Portraits are to a great extent more collaborative. They're more collaboration with the patron and the sitter than other types of art are. It's your picture being painted, so you want to have some say in how you're presented. They're a way for individuals to kind of construct an image of themselves, construct how they want to be seen. That's one reason why it tells us so much about a moment in time. So we're going to see some phenomenal portraits. This is very much Leonardo's style. He really is the first to use this sfumato. He's really the only one. Nobody else really will use it as much as him. Sfumato means smoke, and it refers to this hazy quality. I mean, when we look at some of the details, you can see there's no hard lines around her face or hard lines anywhere. It's just very soft. We'll come back to this in another detail in just a few minutes.
Just
Yes.
one thing, maybe you covered it and I didn't get it, but Giocondo is spelled one way and then another way at the top.
La Gioconda is the feminine version. Her name, that's her husband's name.
Thank
So
you.
she is Mrs. Giocondo, but she was referred to as La Gioconda, the female. Thank you. Good point. So anyway, that haziness is really a hallmark, as is this background. He uses these sort of fantasy backgrounds. That's not anywhere in Italy. They're otherworldly. I don't know where this hazy place is. He's using atmospheric perspective. We've seen that used earlier. It's where, you know, the farther away something is, you make it lighter in color and hazier. It's what actually happens when you look through atmosphere. Like if you're looking at mountains, if you're out driving someday and look at mountains way off in the distance, they're going to look kind of grayish. That's because you're looking through more and more atmosphere, and that distorts the color. So again, it's like linear perspective. It's a recognition of how people see and then using that in a painting to create an illusion. So he's very good at atmospheric perspective. In a painting like this. He's painting it all in very good detail. Now, people talk a great deal about this painting and talk about it as being enigmatic. I'm not sure it's particularly enigmatic. Look at her face. I think one reason people have, it is mysterious, and the haziness of it makes it a bit mysterious. Some of you may remember when I talked about this painting before. One thing you may notice is she doesn't have any eyebrows. Now, this is important. This is very common in the Renaissance. Foreheads were considered very beautiful. So women would shave their heads, shave their hair way back to enlarge their foreheads, and they would shave their eyebrows, again, to exaggerate the foreheads and make them really big. It was seen as beautiful. Now, the only problem with that is that eyebrows are incredibly expressive. We may not realize it. Go around and look at people now after this and watch their eyebrows. But most of what we read from people is in their eyebrows. If somebody's lying to you, there's a little twitch of an eyebrow. We talk about people smiling with their eyes. They don't smile with their eyes, they smile with their eyebrows. And it has to do with subtle lifts. There are more muscles moving the eyebrows than anywhere else on the human face. It's very, very important in reading. Now, without that, you're kind of left without the ability to read her face. And I'm personally sure that that's why people find this smile enigmatic, because they're not getting any cues from eyebrows, which would tell you the authenticity of the smile, whether it's real or not real. There's something hidden about her. And we feel there's something hidden because she doesn't have eyebrows, not because she's really trying to hide anything. But start looking at people's eyebrows. Now I'm feeling self-conscious. Uh-oh, you're enigmatic. You're an enigma. But that's certainly one of the reasons. So hugely influential. It was not ever delivered to the sitters. Yes,
I'd like to interrupt you.
that's okay, please.
I heard that that painting has never been restored.
You're probably right. I don't know, but probably.
Makes you kind of wonder what it would look like if it were.
I doubt if it's, you know, when something is painted correctly, it may not need restoration. Cleaning, most paintings need cleaning, but any more than that. Now, when I say painted correctly, what I mean is if you're painting in layers, and I'm going to talk more about how they built up layers, but it was really important to let every layer thoroughly dry before you paint another layer. If you do that, oil paints will last a very long time and they'll be in very good shape. If you don't, if you know, just get a little, I just can't wait anymore, and you put that next layer on before the bottom layer is completely dry, you're gonna start getting cracks and it's gonna be problematic. So some are in terrible shape and some are in perfect shape, and that's why. They just didn't let it dry properly. This seems to be in good shape. This is still painted on wooden panel.
Peggy, I just shared
Yeah.
with you a link that says, some engineer named Coate says that she did have eyebrows, but they went away with time and cleaning.
They would have been very, very thin then. There are
Yeah.
many Renaissance paintings where the women don't have eyebrows. They did shave them. That is a Renaissance fact. That she had them, I didn't realize that, but doesn't change, you know, how we look at them. They really did shave their head. You'll see some Renaissance paintings where their hair, it's really weird. Like a hairline is way back on the head. If you've ever seen that, it just looks bizarre. They're shaved.
Today too.
What women do for beauty. Okay, he never delivered this. He still had this with him. Leonardo suffered a stroke and lost the use of his right hand. And so he never finishes for a long time to his final satisfaction. He left Italy in 1516 to go to France to work for Francis I, the French king. And we're going to talk more about that because it's in the 16th century. The French kings are beginning to come to power and they're drawing artists to Paris in large numbers. Well, Leonardo is one of the first Italians to leave and go up to work in France. But the French king, many others will in the next few centuries. But he did supposedly finish. He died in 1517. And supposedly it was finished, but we'll never know. But it was never delivered. It was in the possession of the French kings. It's in the Louvre now. That's why it's just been in the possession of the French kings since his death. So it never really was a portrait that went to the Giocondo family. And we don't have a Leonardo, of course, but we do have a Lorenzo di Credi in the Nelson. Lorenzo di Credi studied with Andrea del Verrocchio, which is Leonardo's teacher as well. And he knew Leonardo and they were both studying with Verrocchio at the same time. So there are certain qualities or characteristics in this painting that reflect that influence. It's a Madonna and Child with the infant St. John, a very common theme at the time. And Leonardo has his own version. Leonardo did 2 different versions of Madonna of the Rocks in his fantasy environment. Credi seems to be giving us also a similar kind of fantasy environment with that hazy background. The difference, of course, being Credi's is much sharper, brighter color. The space is clearer. Leonardo gives us the mystery and the dark grotto in the back and the angel pointing at St. John. And when you see this trio of St. John and Jesus, they're almost always, John is praying and Christ is blessing him, even as babies, as a sign of who they will be, as a sign of, you know, John recognizing who this person is, even at this young age. Michelangelo, yes.
Have you sent copies of the slot? That's the last,
Yeah, I just added this.
that's the last one.
Oh, really? There's no,
I
thought they don't always come through. I send them and they don't come through. I'll resend the last group. I don't know why. I just know that some people don't get them at all. Some people get half of them and don't get the rest, but I'll resend. Thank you. Please let me know, because usually when I send them, I think I'm sending them all. So tell me what you get and what you don't get, if you care. Let's move on to our next High Renaissance master, and that is Michelangelo. who is first and foremost and in his own mind a sculptor, not a painter. He always argued he wasn't a painter. He didn't really want to paint. He wanted to sculpt, and that is his contribution. And this is the second of our Davids. I'll remind you that Donatello will come up again in just a few minutes. He painted this when he was still fairly young. He sculpted this when he was fairly young. The original is now indoors. The one outside is, of course, a replica to protect it. But I like that viewpoint of the image on the right, because this was originally intended to be placed at the top of Florence Cathedral. This was meant to be viewed at that angle from very, very low looking up. And you need to know that because it accounts for the strange proportions of the figure. When you look at it straight on, like the photo on the left, which is not how you're supposed to look at it, he has very short legs. You see, they're proportionally short. And that's because he's working with perspective. And if you look at an angle, that elongated the legs. So when you look at the right, his legs don't look short. They look very, very long. So that's why he's taking this into account. Michelangelo was never, ever concerned with mathematical accuracy of anything. He was an intuitive person. He didn't calculate, doesn't do that. He just works. The block of marble that this is carved from, it's a Carrara marble, a beautiful white Carrara marble, was quarried about 100 years earlier. And a David was commissioned, but the artist that started it, he just started working and he saw a little crack. He uncovered a crack in the marble and he stopped. I'm not working with this. That's the problem with marble. You don't know if there's a crack inside there. You could be chiseling away, you know, for months or years, and then just one tap and the whole thing just splits and falls apart. It happens. Because you don't know, and he just stopped. No other artist was willing to touch this block. It's this massive 6-ton block of marble. Nobody would touch it. And this young Michelangelo comes along and says, I'll do it. And he just took it and started chiseling away and had no problems. It didn't go through. He was just lucky. I mean, let's face it, he was lucky. It could have broken, but he was young and just didn't have any fear that many of the other sculptors did have. Of course, you've all heard the statement he's well known for saying, what he does when he approaches a block of marble is he releases the figure inside. He had a way of thinking three-dimensionally, and you see this in his paintings as well. That's unique. And then he just removed everything that wasn't David. I mean, that's how he saw it. David was already there, and he just removed all the other stuff.
Do you know how long it took to do that?
A while. I don't. Well, 1501 to 1504. 3 years.
3 years.
Which is still pretty good, because this is not the sort of thing you have a bunch of assistants helping you with, like a big painting. This is different. This is him. This is his hands. Nobody else is gonna touch this. So it never did make it to the top of Florence Cathedral. It also was made in Florence, and it also symbolized the city, as did the first one that we saw. In this case, however, he's chosen a different moment. We talked about the fact that in a narrative, and the story of David and Goliath is a narrative, you have to choose a moment in that narrative. Sculpture is not really the best medium for storytelling. Let's face it, it's not. It's a frozen moment, just like a painting is. It's a frozen moment. So how do you make a sculpture that tells this whole story? Well, you have to choose. Well, there are different ways. You can do weird things. Sometimes they experimented with showing multiple moments in a story. In a sculpture, it doesn't really work. It works better in a painting. But you choose a moment. And of course, you have 3 choices. The moment before the action, during the action, or after the action. And we saw in Donatello's, he chose after the action. I'll remind you of that, but it was all done Donatello's story, here's the deed, it's done. Now, he's still in the Renaissance, so he's still going to give us a classical moment, and the classical moment refers to a moment before or after the action. In the Renaissance, most of the time, they're not going to give you the action. That's not classical. They're going to give you the quiet moment. But to make it dramatic, somewhat dramatic, emotional, at the very least, a reserved sense of drama, he's choosing the moment before. Now, there's more drama before than after because you don't know what's going to happen. He's maybe not in the middle of the action, but he doesn't know what's going to happen. Now, it is carved in the round. This is carved all the way around. However, it's basically frontal. It was going to go on the top of the cathedral, and you were really going to only be able to see one side of the piece. So it's basically frontal. However, if you do walk around it, the only thing that adds to the story is in his left hand, he is holding the sling, and it's across his back, and from the back you can see the sling in his hand. That's the only thing that's in the back. It's actually his right hand that's more important. Here's Donatello's earlier version, where we have a much more youthful David with the head of Goliath at his feet, in a much more relaxed. I mean, first of all, he's a young boy, so he's not going to have like the six-pack that our later David has. Michelangelo is giving us a more mature David in his view. But I think the most important things to look at are his head and his hand. I absolutely love that hand. He's actually holding a stone in that hand, and it's oversized. It's very large. It draws your eye right to that hand. You can see it there. It's a very big hand that your eye goes right to. Look at the veins in the hand, the details that he can capture, as he's really looked. You know, by this time, artists are attending dissections at medical schools. Artists will go and watch anatomy classes dissecting the body. They know what muscles are, what veins are, and they're bringing that knowledge into the art. But look at that face. It's a controlled energy, and there's a real power in that. It's like he's like a bomb waiting to go off. He's looking across, look at the eyebrows. He's just spotted Goliath. He's just seen it. It's just that moment of drama, and yet his body is completely controlled. At first, he looks relaxed, right? At first, he looks like that's contrapposto stance, right? It's a very relaxed stance. But then you look at the torso and you see the muscles are really quite tense. He's not as relaxed as he looks. And then you look at that hand and that face, and you realize he's not relaxed. He's controlling this, and he's ready to release this energy. It's very similar to what Leonardo was doing in the Last Supper. You know, it's not an outward drama. It's Leonardo's was a little more poignant. Michelangelo has a different personality completely. It's a bit more intense. Michelangelo is, in my opinion, was a man who lived at the wrong time. He lived about 100 years too early. If he had lived 100 years later, he would have been in the Baroque. And I think that would have suited his sensibility better. He was a very emotional person, a very passionate person, but he was constrained by the time he lived. When we get to the Baroque in the 17th century, you'll see another David and what a Baroque artist can do when he lets loose and has the freedom to do that. Michelangelo didn't have the freedom, but he did what he could do. This is what you could do this moment in time, what this person could do at this moment in time. I would love to have seen what he would have done 100 years later.
When you say you didn't have the freedom, are you talking about what kind of cultural expectations?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't mean there were rules or anybody telling him he couldn't. It just didn't occur to him to do it. It wouldn't be what anyone expected. It would have been inappropriate. It would have been seen as probably coarse and crude, not intellectual. The Renaissance is intellectual. It would have seen as appealing to wrongly to your gut instincts as opposed to your intellect. So yeah, it's totally a cultural thing. It wouldn't have occurred to him to violate cultural norms. That's true of every time period. It's true of today as much as anywhere else. We think of, go ahead.
Didn't he also do that Moses? Didn't Michelangelo do that Moses that has a really intense thing?
Yes, he did. Because this is early Michelangelo. Michelangelo changes. He is the only one who will remain working in Rome when the High Renaissance ends, and he's going to be responsible for ushering in a new type of art. And we'll look at his later art, and it is different. It's ushering in a new Mannerist style. So this is still very early. But you're right, he did do that Moses, that was part of a tomb, a Pope's tomb, I believe, as well. But let's look at his painting now and talk about that. He didn't want to paint. He didn't consider himself a painter. But for some reason, Julius did. Now, the Sistine Chapel was built earlier. It was built in 1477 to 80, and it was built by the Pope Sixtus IV. And it's named after him. That's what Sistine means. Sistine is an adjective relating to the name Sixtus. So it's the Sistine Chapel is the chapel of Pope Sixtus IV. Originally the ceiling was painted just blue with stars, which is not uncommon in domes, going back into even the Middle Ages. But Julius, one of the first of these new powerful popes, who wanted these big massive tombs, and he was a politician, and he wanted a lot of things. He wanted a big voice. He wanted to be seen as an intellectual, a literate person. He was a great patron of the arts, and he actually forced Michelangelo to paint the ceiling. He didn't want to do it. He already had the commission for the tomb of Julius II, but Julius threatened to take that commission away from him unless he painted the ceiling. And so begrudgingly, every sculptor wanted that commission. The commission for the tomb of the Pope, yeah, he was not going to lose that commission. So he agreed to do it, and it was apparently hell every day. I mean, he wrote about it, he talked about how miserable he was, how miserable Julius was. They did not get along. Julius would come in all the time and, how are you doing? Almost done? I mean, it was that sort of like, get the hell out of here sort of thing. In fact, Julius first wanted to employ coffers, meaning realistic coffers. Remember, coffers are those sort of square recessed squares that go back to Rome. We saw them in the dome of the Pantheon, either octagonal or square, and we'll see them in other architecture. He just wanted that, and Michelangelo said no, and then he wanted 12 apostles on thrones, and Michelangelo said, no, I'm not going to do that. And Julius got mad and said, then do whatever the hell you want to do, and walked out. But he didn't mean do whatever you want to do, because he still had to have the approval of church officials. So he worked with church officials and really came up with a plan. So this is really Michelangelo's design and plan. Now we're going to come back later and look at the back wall, because that was done about 30 years later and is in a different style from the ceiling. So that's what we're going to look at. Now, the ceiling has been preserved and cleaned. And this took place throughout the decade of the 80s. I can remember in the 80s, because I was in school pretty much the whole decade of the 1980s in one way or another. And I remember the controversy in the art world. It's all you read. When it was decided that these needed to be cleaned and preserved, The Italians decided they were going to do it. This has to be done by Italians. We're not, all the people all over the world wanted to send people in and work on it. So there was a big controversy over this, and the Italians won. It's in Italy, and wouldn't let anyone but Italian preservationists work on this. And as they began cleaning it, a controversy arose. And let me show you why. Here is a section of the ceiling before it was cleaned. And this is what it looked like after it was cleaned. Now, after it was cleaned and these images started to be published, everyone started going crazy because they absolutely argued that you have destroyed this ceiling, that some chemicals you're working with are creating these colors, that this is not what it would have looked like. It couldn't have looked like this. You've really screwed it up. And I mean, that's all you heard in the 80s was article after article, and Italians defending themselves and experts coming in to view it and writing more articles about it. And the reason it was controversial is that there is this long-standing bias that still exists that says sculptors aren't colorists, that if you're a sculptor, you don't really have a sense of color. Only painters really know color, and sculptors can't really know color. And as these colors came out, this couldn't be what it really looked like, because Michelangelo was a sculptor. Now, that's pure bias, because as time went on and more experts came in and reviewed the practices and got involved with it, the clearer it became obvious and undeniable, this is what it looked like. Nobody ruined anything, nobody screwed anything up, but it was very controversial for a long time before it was finally accepted. And I would bet there's still probably people out there that still haven't accepted the fact, but it really is true. These are the real colors, and they're stunning. Michelangelo was a brilliant colorist. And it's unlike any other fresco or painting of its type in terms of its intensity of color. Now, the program that he devised is complex, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but the main scenes are a series of 9 that start, I believe, over the altar with the separation of light and dark. There are 9 scenes from Genesis. And they end with the drunkenness of Noah, and they move directly across. Now, there are lots of other images. There are prophets and sibyls from the Old Testament and the ancient world. There are scenes of the family of Jesus, figures from the tree of Jesse, which we talked about before, and other scenes. But I just really want to focus on the main scenes, and we'll primarily focus on one. Now, this is a ceiling painting, but Michelangelo was not only not a painter, he was not a ceiling painter. And painting a ceiling has required skills. There were people who were professional ceiling painters. And I want to show you a ceiling painting by an artist named Andrea Mantegna, who actually was from Venice. He was part of the Bellini circle. Remember the 2 Bellini brothers? Mantegna actually married their sister. So he was a brother-in-law of the Bellinis and part of that really progressive group in Venice. But he also was a master ceiling painter. And so when a master does it, he paints a ceiling de sotto in su. And de sotto in su means literally as seen from below. Now, when you're looking at that painting from Mantua that Mantegna did, he's sort of created this illusionistic oculus or hole in a dome, and you're seeing the figures, he's painting them, he's foreshortening them dramatically so that it looks like you're literally looking up at them. Now, that's how you paint a ceiling. That's a real illusion of a ceiling, is painting something as if it's from below. That is not what Michelangelo is doing in this ceiling. Everything in the Sistine ceiling is just seen from the side. He's just put it over your head, but you're still looking at it from the side. And you can see that. We're going to look at this one, the most famous one, the creation of Adam, which is located right here in the center. Notice we're seeing it from the side. He could have painted it on the side wall. He just happened to paint it above. Now, that is not the most progressive way to paint a ceiling at this time. However, you know, he's got enough new things. He's doing a fresco. He's doing this massive, really uncomfortable. He was in constant pain, working, standing up, trying to work. I've already talked about how much heat a fresco puts out every day, how miserable it would have been. It was just hell. He was in constant pain doing this, but this is the image I want to look at. Here's the before and after of the creation of Adam. That's what it looked like before it was cleaned. Yes,
Could you go back?
where?
The one, okay, right there, right there.
Yeah,
See, just to down from and to the left of Adam. That's
Here? Here?
down, and then and to the left, but come down
Yep,
and over to the left.
here.
Yeah. Okay, and that's
That's the image we were just looking at.
right.
Yeah,
And those colors look different to me now in this than in the previous.
it's always going to be a slight variation because they're
Just go
reproduce
back
color.
one more. Yeah,
it's a little more intense, maybe.
well, I mean, they're different colors.
Well, then maybe it's not the same one.
Well, see, they're,
No, that's her.
see,
I don't
there's
see
yellow
much
and there's red.
Yeah. Well, it's a kind of purpley red.
Okay.
That's the problem with photography. You can't ever correctly capture images of paintings.
And then one other thing, so they're looking at this as a fresco related to sculpture, and that's why they're concerned about these colors. I mean.
No, it's a fresco painted by a sculptor, by a man who shouldn't know how to use color.
Oh, I get it.
That's
Okay.
it.
I-
They
I
didn't-
missed that.
Yeah, they didn't think a sculptor could paint like this,
Okay.
and they were wrong, because he did.
So you said he stood, but I thought I had rather be laid on. his back.
Yeah, he talked about standing. He probably did both. I mean, I've seen images, but from everything he said, I mean, how do you do that? The scaffolding would have to be up this high. How do you even get in that position? I don't see how you can lay down unless you have like multiple layers of a scaffolding. You might be able to do it, in which case you're working with this wet medium that's like, yeah. On
How
your,
many years did it take her to do?
several, yeah, no, from 08 to 12. Michelangelo's David was 3 years. This is longer. This is, yeah.
Was this alone or did he have assistants up there?
I think alone.
Well, he probably had people.
He had assistants preparing everything, yes. He had assistants preparing everything, but I'm pretty sure his hand is the only one that, exactly. The layers before and preparing everything, he would had assistants, so he never had to stop painting, which is probably worse, because he never got a break. Okay, so let's look at this. Now, this is very, very unusual, and this is showing a man who's not really, doesn't want to be limited by his age. This is a very dynamic scene. There's a lot of movement in this scene. He's divided into two parts. We get Adam, this sort of unformed Adam. He's sort of limp, you know, it's not quite the spark jumping. There's a tiny little space there between their fingers. What's really interesting is this group over here. This is God the Father, and we haven't seen many images of God. I'll remind you of one in a minute. Swooping in, this figure is usually identified as Mary. It's an unusual version of Mary because she's sort of nude. I mean, it's odd. And then this as perhaps Jesus, because God's hand is sort of on his shoulder, but they're unusual depictions of them. The colors, I mean, I just love this color, this sort of turquoise, and that blue hair and beard are just magnificent. Now, in terms of female figures. Remember when I said Michelangelo can't sculpt a female figure? I said that last time. I'm gonna prove it to you now. This is a female figure from the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici. And I swear to God, that is a man with breasts. Very lopsided, awkward, misplaced breasts, but look at it. That's a male body. That is 100% a male body. And he does that a lot.
I love how like God looks like the John Brown,
Yeah.
Not Brown, it's a Luther Brown or something, I think.
Don't know that one.
Yeah, it's in the Kansas State Capitol.
Yeah, John
Oh.
Brown's body.
Oh, no, don't know that one.
A close-up of Mary, there she is.
Yeah, I can see a little better here. Here's the last time we saw God was in the Ghent altarpiece, very different conception of God. This is God as Zeus. I mean, this is more ancient God, it's more pagan God. It's a Jupiter or a Zeus more than anything else. And I don't know who else that would be other than Mary, but it's just so grossly inappropriate way to show Mary.
We have Mary in the Old Testament. It's a creation of Adam.
Well, she's coming. I mean, she's being prefigured. I mean,
Because of the creation of Adam would have been Old Testament.
yeah, but they would have all, but don't be so modern. You're being very,
Like, okay.
this is all like the future that, you know, God has under his arm, not necessarily. But it's just bizarre. It's just seems strangely inappropriate way to show the Virgin Mary.
She looks like a movie star.
Blonde and nude. It's the nudity that bothers me. You just don't depict the Virgin Mary that way.
She was just a,
Maybe it's Eve.
maybe just a friend.
That's it. Maybe it's Eve.
It could be.
This is Adam. He's bringing Eve. Now that totally makes sense.
Because I have trouble doing the Hebrew Bible creation with the current Mary. That doesn't-
Well, no, that's not a problem. You know, they mix up the time because this isn't supposed to be real time. This is, you know,
Okay.
God's reality. But
It could be Mary.
Eve makes much more sense. That's got to be Eve. So I don't know who the child is then. See, he has his hand on him and there's only one child. So I don't know who that's supposed to be. But yeah, that's got to be Eve. Okay, let's look at that form. Now, I'm not sure I buy this, but someone, I don't know, somewhere in the last couple of decades or 33 or 4 decades, noticed that weird shape of that billowing thing and said, well, that's the shape of a human brain. And that he's making an allusion to intellectualism and religion. And that's actually widely bought by, I would almost say, most art historians. I don't personally buy that.
Talking about the red,
Yes,
okay.
it is the shape of a human brain, but then so what? I mean, that doesn't,
More like a heart to me.
a heart? Oh, human heart. Yeah.
Reminds me of an artist's palette.
Yeah, yeah. Is that too?
Or maybe it was just for contrast.
Or maybe it's just some sort of piece of fabric billowing in the air.
The contrast with the blue and the.
Yeah, and just for the color. I mean, the color is incredible. These are not your primary colors. These are sophisticated colors that he's using, that probably threw them off as well. When we look at Adam, you see how, you know, unformed the land is and him. And now, while this is such an incredible cliche today, in art, it wasn't when Michelangelo painted it. It was in totally original conception. But that body, look at that's a very three-dimensional body. That is something painted by someone who sees in 3 dimensions. And people often talk about that as sort of a sculptural body. And from this point on, artists that see that begin painting that way. This is what's called the Michelangesque body. And artists begin doing this once they see him doing it. It's a very different conception. In terms of the overall composition, it is not classically composed. This is driven by diagonal lines, by movement. It's moving from right to left as God is swooping in, and these parallel diagonals. This is very, very different than anything we've seen before in Renaissance art. And it really is very early for that, and identifies someone who is going to move on into a different direction a little later in the 16th century. So a very important work.
How was that work received? Was it?
At the time?
Sensibilities or?
At the time, it was very well received by artists. I know a lot of artists who went in there to look at what he was doing while he was working. And you can see in art how he's influenced people, not necessarily by the odd dynamic composition. They're not going to all start doing that, not at all. But the figures, the more sculptural sense of the figures is going to have an impact. And particularly on this person, not at this time yet. This is a young Raphael. Raphael, another of our High Renaissance masters, is the least well known to us today, but the most successful and well known at the time. He was the archetypal and greatest painter of the Renaissance. He is still my personal favorite artist of the Renaissance. And he will be in the 19th century. The academies of the 18th and 19th century are going to look to Raphael. I mean, he's a huge inspiration. He's not idiosyncratic. Leonardo's idiosyncratic. Michelangelo's idiosyncratic. Raphael was not the great innovator. He was the great synthesizer. He could take all these ideas and put them together.
Peggy?
Yeah, I just lost my microphone. Yes?
Oh, I'm looking at the Raphael right now.
Yes.
I'm noticing all these infants seem to have very large heads.
Yeah, they do. They're better than the Middle Ages, however. They're getting closer to rationalism. So yeah, they're not perfect. He's very young still here.
Okay, this is the third time I've seen big-headed babies.
Remember those icons of the Middle Ages?
Yes.
They were really disproportionate. They're
Yeah,
getting better.
Okay,
And this is a young Raphael. He's going to get better.
okay.
Can you all hear me okay? I don't want to get feedback, but helps to be tall. How's that? Still not very good. It's up all the way. Okay, we'll try this. Is this working? Okay, it's hard for me to hear it from here. Okay, so Raphael is our great synthesizer. He was very successful. Now, when I say successful, he was the most successful Renaissance artist. To be successful is not a matter of being good. And that's true then, and it's true now. Throughout all of history, there are things that make an artist successful, and it's not limited to the quality of the art they make. You have to be a certain kind of person. You have to interact with people in a certain way. You have to be able to talk about your art and interact with rich patrons. Some people can't do that. Michelangelo's terrible interacting with people. He had a horrible he was always in conflict with people. He was belligerent. Leonardo wasn't a whole lot better. Raphael was a perfect courtier. He interacted in the circles, the right circles. He knew how to be in the right place at the right time, to sell himself and his work. But he also became a great artist. This is one of the, he did a lot of Madonna and child images. This is known as the small Cowper Madonna, as opposed to the large Cowper Madonna, is why it's called that. Cowper is a reference to, I believe, a family that owned it at one point in time. Names are kind of weird. Let me reiterate, and if I haven't said it in this class yet, artists are not giving these works of art titles. Titles don't exist yet. These are names given to works of art generally when someone had to put it on an inventory list, they had to describe it in some way. So they just described what the story was, or in this case, well, this is the small painting that the Cowper family once owned. We're going to call it that. Artists don't begin putting titles on that affect the meaning of a work of art before the 19th century and maybe even the late 19th century. And in the 20th century, it's become much more important where the title can actually affect and change the meaning of what you see, but that is not what's happening at this point. So what we have is now a very Renaissance conception. One of the things that the church asked for was artists to make art that people could identify with or connect with emotionally. So this is his attempt to depict a mother and child. In fact, if it weren't, there's not a lot here that says Madonna and child. This could be any mother and any child. There's no overt symbolism. It's in an Italian landscape. It's meant to be a very intimate scene. The way of particular importance are things like the child's foot on her hand, which is a quiet, sort of intimate moment. His hand here on her neck. These are meant to be important. And he was very, very good at this. This is oil on wood, still painted in a very linear style. Here's a detail. You can see he did very well. There are very few cracks. You do see how smooth this is. No brushwork visible. You do see that some craquelure here. And craquelure is a reference to the cracks, but what makes it interesting is they're cracking right along the brush strokes. So you can see how he worked. You can see how he laid down the brush strokes. He's making contour lines, and contour lines are lines that follow the exterior surface of a form. So it's following the shape and curvature of that. Now this Marian blue drapery, and the craquelure is sort of revealing those brushworks, but that wouldn't have been visible at the time. That would have been very smooth. Okay, let's talk portraiture. I'm now showing you my very favorite portrait ever painted, and it's very close to being my very favorite painting ever painted. I absolutely love this painting, and I'll tell you why, and maybe I can get you to start loving portraits more. This is his portrait of Baldassare Castiglione. It's very much of a moment in time, but also really demonstrates Raphael's incredible skill that we can see here. Baldassare Castiglione was a writer, and he wrote a book called The Courtier. He had been at court. He was part of the court in Urbino of Duke Montefeltro. He was a close friend of Geobaldo de Montefeltro, who was the Duke of Urbino. And he was a sort of courtier in that circle. And when the Duke died, the older Duke died in when did he write the book? 1508. He wrote this book about court life, and it's based on court life in Urbino at the court of the Duke. And it's a kind of etiquette book. It's a kind of behavior manual. It's how a courtier should behave, how an elegant person should behave. And I love the book here. This is actually the first English printing of the Courtier, which was printed in 1588. And we can read it here. It says, very necessary and profitable for young gentlemen and gentlewomen abiding in court, palace, or place, done into English by Thomas Hobby. I love this version of English because you still see where they're using this letter that's sort of a variation of an F as an S, if you encounter that. And this is very, so it's, I just love the description of it. But according to Baldassare Castiglione, a cultured person, an aristocratic person, courtier should be cultured, civilized, learned, humble, and kind. And he wanted his portrait by Raphael to communicate every one of those things. And Raphael was a master at accommodating his needs. The most powerful part of this painting is that beautiful chocolate brown background. I just think that is the most beautiful color I have ever seen. It's just luscious and warm and inviting. And when you see this man, he is someone everybody wants to know. He is the grandfather everyone wants to have. He's not showy. That background is very different. This is not this elegant landscape or fantasy scape. It's just this very, very warm space, wall behind him. It's hard for us to tell, but if you look at a lot of Renaissance portraits, men often wore a lot of jewelry, a lot of gold, big gold necklaces and other things. He has none of those things. That's showing his humility. He is, however, wearing beautiful fur garments. Let's look at how he's depicting these textures, these wonderful textures. You can see the brush, the kind of dry brush technique over the top to create this illusion of fur and velvet. So he's a wealthy man. He's at court. He's a courtier, but he's not being showy about it. He's being humble about it. He's smiling with his eyes. To me, this is a perfect example. You know, his mouth isn't turned up, but his eyes are lifted in such a way that there's a kind of lighthearted, he's looking at you with a kind of benevolence and almost a bit of lighthearted humor. All of these little subtle things are done. Yes.
Can you just go real close to his face?
Let's go in on his face. Good idea. Eyebrows, yes. They're almost a little quizzical too. They're almost a little like this one. There's not really a crease here, but this brow in particular is suggesting he's got a question, or he's just maybe seen someone enter the room, or I don't know what's going on in his mind, but something's going on in his mind. He's not vacant. He's looking at something, and just a little bit of a question maybe being asked.
Looks like the lips are parted.
Slightly, they may be, or just in the process of doing so.
Just like a little, not a grin, but just a little tiny.
It's possible.
Maybe it's the mustache, but it looks like the lips.
Yeah, with all that, yeah, it's hard to see. But this is a velvet hat, and his beard. Again, we're seeing the detail, but it's very, very refined. Occasional little brush strokes to emphasize the texture, but his depiction of Castiglione is very, very warm. And I think he was the portrait painter. Portraits have been since the Renaissance on, have been the bread and butter for most artists. And that is true until the 19th century, until photography comes along. Most artists had to make a living, and maybe they wanted to paint great altarpieces, but you don't always get those commissions, and you have to, pay the rent. And that's what portraits were for most artists. And he was the foremost, in every generation, there's one artist who dominates portraiture. And for Raphael's generation, it was him. Yes.
Where is that painting?
Nope. No, I'm sorry I keep saying that, but when we're studying art history, we don't study where something is, especially when it's can move. You know where buildings are because that's part of what they are. But knowing where a painting is doesn't tell me anything about that painting. It has nothing to do with history. Where that painting is tells us about things that happened later. But for what we're generally interested in, it's not relevant where this ended up in the 20th century. 21st, pardon me.
I guess I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's why I didn't learn where they are.
Have you seen it, Peggy?
I have in person, no, I have not, or I would remember where it was.
Well, it's the liveness of the original that is what's interesting.
Yeah, but they've captured it in here perfectly. I fell in love with the reproduction. I don't particularly want to see the original because it might be different and I don't want to know. Same reason you don't want to see a classical Greek sculpture painted purple. I mean, you don't want it. I don't want. I mean, that's not true. I would like to see it, but this is an image. I talked about reproduction and how you can't be sure and how colors change, but I've seen hundreds of reproductions of this and it always looks this way. These are colors that do reproduce. There are some colors that don't reproduce well, and they're always problematic. Green is one of them. It's really hard to reproduce greens and get the accurate green. That's why you should never judge Cézanne by a reproduction. Cézanne, you gotta see in person because he uses a particular green that cannot be reproduced. And until you see the work, there are no good reproductions. These are not colors like that. Yes, Linda?
I'm thinking about these three of the big five painters. Do we know what any of them looked like? Were they?
Yeah. Yeah, there are self-portraits. I'm going to show you self-portrait of Raphael in just maybe today, maybe next time. Here's a comparison. Love comparisons. They tell us a lot. Here is Leonardo's portrait versus Raphael's portrait. And of course, Raphael is borrowing from Leonardo. It's a half length, 3/4 view. He's picking that up and learning how to do it. But Leonardo's taking us into this other realm. He's giving us this mystery, not ground. He's not trying to ground it in a real person. People see Mona Lisa as a mystery. That's sort of part of it. Raphael doesn't want us to see a mystery. He wants us to see this person and to look at him.
Is the entire portrait without the complete hands? I mean, is it?
Yes.
Off the hands?
Yeah. And by the 17th century, you're not even going to see the hands. They're going to be in shadow. We're focusing more and more over time on the face. His most famous work, however, is a giant fresco, actually 4 of them in one room in the Vatican, in a room called the Stanza della Segnatura, which means room of signatures. It is the private library of the Pope. The room of signatures is a reference to the fact that this is where all papal edicts are signed. It's a room reserved for the signing of papal edicts. When this is Julius II again, commissions Raphael to paint the 4 walls. He wanted this room identified with him, to speak of who he was, and he wanted to be seen as a cultured, learned person. And so each of the 4 walls symbolically presents the 4 branches of knowledge as they were understood in the Renaissance. And at the time, the 4 branches of knowledge were religion, which is depicted by a painting called the Disputa, which we're not going to spend time looking at. Philosophy, which is depicted by the School of Athens, which is the one we will look at. Poetry, depicted by the scene you see on the left here, Parnassus. Parnassus was a mountain in ancient Greece. It's where the muses lived. So it symbolizes poetry, a scene of all the muses. And then law or jurisprudence, which we aren't going to look at, but it symbolizes the cardinal, both the cardinal and theological virtues. It symbolizes both the holy law and earthly law. Now, this idea in the Renaissance that all of human knowledge could be divided into these four things, religion, philosophy, poetry, and law. This is where I used to love to discuss that idea with our students, because we don't divide knowledge in that way. And if you want to know how we divide knowledge, you go to, look up any university card catalog. What colleges do you have and what departments exist within those colleges? We do have religion as a major. There are schools of religion and departments of religion within colleges. The school I taught, we did not have a college of philosophy. We didn't even have a department of philosophy. We did at one point, but they got subsumed into the Department of English and almost disappeared. We certainly didn't have a college of poetry or a department of poetry. Poetry was subsumed as a discipline into the Department of English. We didn't herald poetry that highly. Law, yes, okay, law, we have law schools. So I would say religion and law, we still see them as discrete and important disciplines. However, philosophy, less so, unfortunately, and poetry, not at all. Poetry in the Renaissance was considered the highest art form of all of the arts. Why do you think poetry, how does poetry differ from all of the other arts, whether it's painting, sculpture, theater, even music?
Because of its history from the Greeks. It was how
But
history.
so
was
is
told.
sculpture, theater.
But I mean, it was how in order to have the sculpture, which represents a piece of the history, you have to have the history, and oral history and poetry went together.
Okay, I can see that. But I would also argue that theater was a major art form in the ancient world, as was sculpture. Painting we know less about because it simply didn't last, but we're pretty sure there were paintings of some kind in the ancient world. Now, the reason has to do with how it's made. Well, if I tell you, let me tell you this. If poetry's at the top, at the very, very bottom was sculpture. Now think about the difference between poetry and sculpture.
Metaphor.
They can all use metaphor, but no, you're right. Poetry was seen as the most cerebral. It was the least physical. There was a bias against manual labor. The more physical the art, the more manual labor it took, the lower it was. And the most manual labor was sculpture. You had to go out and quarry stone. Sculptors were at the bottom of the pile. At the very top was the intellectual, mental process of poetry. And that bias against physical labor is one that's, gotten, entrenched in Western culture in general. And you still see that with, white collar, blue collar references. There's still manual labor and physicality. Yeah.
Were they using poetry in a more general sense of all literature, or was it just what we think of as poetry?
No, they were using it as, they weren't not prose. It's poetry.
Not narrative, but
No.
narrative.
Just what we think of as poetry, real phrasing, the phrasing in the language as opposed to narrative and storytelling and prose. That was below poetry.
I think
Yeah.
poetry was like liberal arts.
Well,
Where would you put the rest?
well, there was no concept of liberal arts then. Yeah, no concept of that at all. But that's why poetry gets its own. So none of these walls are referencing any other art forms. So how is Raphael going to find a way to work that in? And he does, because this is also a moment in time when artists were very concerned with their own status. And painters like Raphael wanted respect, and they wanted to be treated as intellectuals and thinkers. And there was an old bias still there that, no, you're not really the intellectual that a poet was. And he's very concerned with demonstrating that. And what we'll do next time, because our time is up, is we're going to start with this painting, and we're going to see how Raphael finds a way to make reference to different art forms without there being an actual wall for them. So we'll stop with that today and begin with this next time. And if you can't be here, we are on Zoom. You can check in on Zoom. Okay, does anybody have any questions or anything else?
Just a reminder to send out the initial.
I'll remind you, send that out. And I think next Friday is Good Friday. But I'm still gonna be here, if that's a, just in case that came up and you wondered if I had noticed. I have noticed, I just didn't care. I'm still gonna be here. Anyway, so I will see you next week, everybody. You're welcome. Okay. Thanks, everybody.